indicated before that when you examine the issue of accountability, one also has to understand the issue of intent, which means in any situation the self is encapsulated with the other, and you could either construct your intent in what you're getting, which moves from other to self, or you can construct your intent in what you're giving, which moves from self to other. Now, what's very important about this difference is that giving is the cause, and the effect is what you get. So the example of this is that the archer strings the bow, knocks the arrow, draws the bow, and lets fly the arrow. That's the cause. That's what the archer does. The effect is whether or not the arrow actually hits the target. This distinction is therefore also consistent with the difference between outcome and process. Process is what you do, what you give. Outcome is what you get. And therefore we say that this is consistent with the distinction between contribution and result. Contribution is what you do, and result is what you get. And our view is that you'd only hold somebody accountable for what sits in their own hands, for their contribution. There's a problem involved with holding people accountable for results. And in fact, this issue of results focus can very often become very toxic in organizations. It can really be the cause of short-term focus and expedient behavior in organizations. We have a thought experiment that demonstrates how problematic this issue of results focused can become. So let's assume you've got two farmers who work for you. The one is called Adrian. You own the two farms, and there's two farmers who work for you. The one is called Adrian, who is a highly skilled farmer, and he works exceptionally hard to get a fantastic crop. He does all the things that are required of him in the course of a season. However, just at the wrong time, there's a plague of locusts, and he loses most of his crop. Rian, on the other hand, is a lazy fellow who spends the entire season on the veranda of his farmhouse. However, lucky for him, just before he plants, there's a hailstorm, so nature puts nitrogen into the soil for him, and as a result, he gets a reasonable crop. Now, the question is, if you held these two people accountable for results, who would you reward and who would you punish? Then clearly you'd end up punishing Adrian and rewarding Rian. Now, clearly that is not rational. So the question then is, how should one regard this whole issue of results and contribution? And it suggests that if you're looking at the whole issue of accountability, there are therefore these two variables you need to bear in mind. The first is what the person does themselves, their contribution, and the second is the result that they get from doing what they do. These two variables get evaluated differently. Results would always give you numbers. It is something that you'd either find in a spreadsheet or on a scoreboard. It's something that would be the outcome of a measuring process. Whereas contribution, if you like, is really concerned with assessing the person's performance against a standard. Let's say, for instance, you're coaching somebody to sprint, and you know that for them to be able to sprint well, they have to lift their legs high enough. And you watch the person in their running, and you, at the end of their run, you indicate to them, but you're not lifting your legs high enough. Now, your assessment of their performance is not subjective, it's perfectly objective. However, it has not produced a number. It is basically what your assessment has been yes, no against a standard. So that's what we're saying. Contribution is something that you assess yes, no against a standard. Now, if you bear these two ways of looking at assessment in mind, and you also bear in mind that somebody's performance can either be above or below in both categories. So the person can either be achieving the measures or not achieving the measures required of them, or be on standard or not on standard in terms of their contribution. It means that you have about 4 basic permutations, and each one of these permutations would have a different implication in terms of the person's accountability. So in the left-hand column, we will nominate the permutation, and in the right-hand column, we will examine the issue of the accountability of the person. So the first permutation is the person does everything required of them and they get a good result. Now, clearly, if somebody does that, you should reward the person. The second permutation is that the person clearly does everything that's required of them, however, they get a bad result. So this is the Adrian example. So Adrian spent the entire season in the fields. He did whatever he could. He did checked the hydration of the soil, did the right chemical analyses, fertilized at the right time, and yet he got a poor result because of an untoward event like the locusts. What are you going to do with Adrian? Clearly, you can't punish the person. You have to recognize and reward the person. Because you might even say that if he didn't do what he had in fact done, you wouldn't just have had a problem with your result, you would have had a catastrophe. Now, what is important though, when one looks at this permutation 2, is that one needs to bear in mind that there are two possible reasons why there was a disconnect between the contribution and the results. The first reason was that you were literally looking at an act of God or force majeure, like in Adrian's case, the plague of locusts. Now, any organization faces things that will affect the organization that the person working in the organization can do absolutely nothing about. You can't then hold that person accountable for a result. And this can also be true at every level of the hierarchy. So say, for instance, a worker in a manufacturing operation does everything required of them. There's a power failure, and despite the fact that the person did everything required of them, their production result wasn't good. You could have the same thing for different reasons all the way up the line. The second possibility in the second permutation is that the standard that was required of the person at the beginning of the reporting cycle was actually inappropriate. In other words, the person did what was required of them, but it couldn't produce a result. If this is the case, then clearly one would just have a new standard or reframe the standard in the next reporting cycle. The third permutation is a reasonably straightforward one. The person doesn't do what's required of them and they get a bad result, and there you should censure or punish the person. In other words, the person then is kind of negatively accountable. They should be disciplined. This fourth permutation is the most complex of the lot. This is where the person doesn't do what's required of them, but they get a good result. In the first instance, you might be dealing with somebody like Rian, who is just careless, just didn't do what was required of them. But if you like, they were very fortunate. The ball sort of bounced in their favor. Like in the Rian case, there was a hailstorm just before he planted, in which case you should censure the person because they were actually careless. It's very important to bear this in mind because very often people get saved by things that happen that they personally have absolutely no influence over and that actually conspire to produce a good result. The second possibility in this permutation 4 is that the person deliberately does short-term things, destructive things, in order to produce a result which actually undermine the viability of the enterprise over a longer period of time. This can be as brazen as somebody literally falsifying information in order to make the scoreboard look better, or it could be just the person sweating the asset to the point where the business no longer is viable. In that case, the person should be punished. In other words, they probably should be dismissed. The third possibility in this fourth permutation is that the person actually was being creative, that the standard that you defined at the beginning of the reporting cycle for their contribution was actually inappropriate. The person, in a sense, went the extra mile, and as a result, they produced a good result. So they didn't act to standard, but their results were good. In that case, you should reward the person. So we can see how absolutely irrational it is just to hold people accountable for results. There's a natural complexity in this whole issue of accountability, and you have to bear both of these variables in mind: contribution and result. And even the 4 permutations that come out by doing that aren't adequate, because in at least 2 cases, in permutation 2 and in permutation 4, you have to account for the disconnect. Why is it that what the person either did do or didn't do aligned with the result that you either wanted to get or didn't get?